Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into the mechanics of psychological control. We're going to objectively decode a pretty erratic, incredibly intense, but absolutely fascinating piece of source material. It's called The Judgment of the Hypnotic Eye. So if you've ever wanted to understand the actual dark architecture behind manipulation, well, you're definitely in the right place. Our entire focus today is mapping out the mechanics of psychological control exactly as this text outlines them. We're going to strip away all the chaotic prose and just look purely at the structured anatomy of how one human, or even a whole system, attempts to completely subjugate another. Okay, let's dive right into this. Literally right out of the gate, the text hits us with this deeply disturbing declaration of righteous subjugation. It says, "We are the seeds of higher intellect born to control you." Crazy, right? But the main takeaway here is the foundational mindset of the controller. According to the source, psychological control doesn't just start with pure malice. No, it starts with this deeply ingrained, almost religious belief in their own superiority. These controllers genuinely believe they're operating from some higher intellectual and moral ground. They aren't just out to break your will, they literally believe they are ordained to do it.
So here's our roadmap for breaking down these mechanics of control today. First, we'll look at the hypnotic observation. Second, the infinite drama triangle. Third, weaponizing guilt and sin. And finally, stage 4, total subjugation. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the hypnotic observation, which is essentially the surveillance phase.
Before you can break someone, you really have to watch them. The source explicitly defines this hypnotic observation as a very specific method used by trained behaviorists. And here's the kicker. They aren't looking for massive, loud acts of rebellion. They are watching for microscopic, ultra-subtle behavioral shifts. Why? Because if a controller can pinpoint your absolute tiniest mistakes, they can judge you, persecute you, and ultimately force you to conform to whatever their definition of normal is. The text frames surveillance purely as a tool for behavioral correction. It's kind of the psychological equivalent of putting someone under a microscope until they just crack under the pressure.
Just listen to this raw, totally unfiltered quote straight from the source. Shh. Sound of hypnosis and voice of hypnotist pinpointing mistakes. See, we are watching you, judging you. It really captures the intense, suffocating pressure of the surveillance phase, doesn't it? That repetition is perfectly designed to induce paranoia. The author is showing us how the constant, whispering threat of being watched is what actually breaks down a person's psychological defenses. The gathering of data isn't the point. The victim's awareness of the surveillance is the weapon itself. Moving right along to Section 2, the infinite drama triangle. This is where we see a highly toxic behavioral loop. So once the subject's defenses are totally worn down by that constant observation, the text taps into a really toxic behavioral loop. The source explicitly claims that reflection is the root cause of an infinite drama triangle. Now, obviously, in any normal context, reflection is how we learn and grow, right? But in this specific architecture of control, reflection is completely weaponized. The controller forces the victim to obsessively fixate on their past actions, their mistakes, and their supposed sins. By trapping them in this constant state of self-reflection and self-doubt, the controller creates an endless loop of drama that the victim simply cannot escape. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact three-step mechanic of this infinite drama triangle exactly as the author outlined it. Just look at the progression here. Step 1, the authority uses their power to manipulate a situation. Then, Step 2, that exact same authority steps in and projects this image of help by rescuing the victim from the very crisis they themselves created. And finally, Step 3, through this fake rescue, the authority gains deep trust, constantly looping the victim's past mistakes to remind them exactly why they need the controller's help in the first place. It is a perfectly closed-loop system of total dependency. Which brings us to Section 3, weaponizing guilt and sin, or moral subjugation. This phase is where the manipulation shifts from behavioral to deep spiritual and moral subjugation. Honestly, this is probably the most chilling paradox in the entire text. It says, freedom of your soul is your own choice to accept suffering as your own sins. The author is basically arguing that true, unbreakable control isn't achieved with physical chains. No, it happens when the victim willingly accepts their own suffering as a totally justified consequence of their so-called sins. The controllers ultimately win when the victim genuinely believes they deserve the punishment. They use the illusion of choice to pour the concrete on this psychological prison. And to manufacture that guilt,
controllers get to define what a sin actually is. The text points out a rather massive hypocrisy when it comes to human sexuality. On the one hand, controllers judge natural sexual habits, fantasies, and alchemy as unrighteous sins. But then, the text neutrally contrasts this with reality, pointing out that every single human is produced through these natural acts, and that sexual force is fundamentally a creative inspiration. So by taking a completely natural human reality and labeling it a sin, the controllers ensure that literally everyone is automatically guilty from day one. And if you're guilty, well, you're controllable.
Let's quickly summarize the core methods they use to weaponize this guilt. First up, claiming absolute righteousness, which often involves citing holy books to make their authority totally unquestionable. Second, they meticulously pinpoint mistakes on their victims. Third, they define totally natural, unavoidable human attractions and behaviors as horrific sins. And finally, they demand suffering and submission as the absolute only acceptable payment for these manufactured sins. And now, Section 4, Total Subjugation, the ultimate goal. Okay, so we've seen the observation, the dependency loop, and the weaponized guilt. Now we arrive at the final stage. The author introduces a really extreme concept here called neural suggestion. Used alongside what the text calls forcing dog behavior, which basically means blind, unquestioning obedience, neural suggestion is all about bypassing the conscious mind entirely. It's the complete and total stripping of human autonomy to turn an individual into, quote, a sinful slave. We're not just talking about making someone follow the rules anymore. This is about completely overriding their internal sense of self. Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is how the author maps out the specific tools used to enforce this subjugation. It totally bridges the mundane, the systemic, and the spiritual. For instance, they use everyday gadgets to communicate scripts that literally force a behavioral response. Then, they use systemic institutions like the police and army to conduct incredibly biased investigations which effectively trap you in your own home. And finally, and this is pretty wild, they deploy this psychological or spiritual force called the Eye of Satan, which is designed specifically to target and destroy a person's inner light and creativity. And that leads us straight to the ultimate goal. According to the source material, the true endpoint of psychological control is not just mere compliance. It's not about getting someone to do your chores. The actual objective is active destruction. The controllers actively seek to destroy talent, creative abilities, and dreams of glory. Why? Well, because a human being with creativity, dreams, and talent is a human being with hope. And hope is, without a doubt, the single greatest threat to a system of total subjugation. The text reaches its pretty grim climax with this striking declaration. Dog and neural suggestion of total control of humans to make you a sinful slave of your sins. That right there is the ultimate endpoint of the author's entire system. It's a state where the individual has been observed, manipulated into a dependency loop, burdened with completely inescapable guilt, and neurologically suggested into becoming a willing participant in their very own enslavement. So as we wrap up this explainer on the judgment of the hypnotic eye, the text leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox to consider. If this entire architecture of psychological control is built and enforced by human controllers who falsely claim divine righteousness, well, who truly holds the moral high ground? As the author points out in the final lines, if the controllers are committing the ultimate crime of destroying human potential, who truly gets to pass judgment on them when the day of judgment finally arrives? I'll leave you with that powerful concept to ponder. Thanks for focusing in with us today, and remember to always keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.